Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this discussion of the creative artist between two creative artists that worked on Sweet Land. I did want to let everyone know that tonight Du Young was not able to join us, but hopefully we will get to hear from her again at another time. It's my pleasure to welcome in this virtual world of the Colorado Springs Fine Arts Center at Colorado College, Raven Chacon, who is a composer, performer, and installation artist from Fort Defiance of the Navajo Nation. As a solo artist, collaborator, or with Post Commodity, Chacon has exhibited or performed at the Whitney Biennial, Documenta 14, Red Cat, San Francisco Electronic Music Festival, Chaco Canyon, End Times Festival, the 18th Biennial of Sydney, and the Kennedy Center. Every year, he teaches 20 students to write string quartets for the Native American Composer Apprentice Project. And he also taught at Colorado College when he was the artist in residence through the Andrew W. Mellon Grant for Southwest Arts and Culture. He is the recipient of the United States Artist Fellowship in Music, a Creative Capital Award in Visual Arts, and the Native Arts and Culture Foundation Artist Fellowship, as well as the American Academy's Berlin Prize for Music Composition. And it's my pleasure to bring him here tonight as an artist and also the moderator for this discussion. Cannupa Hanska is a New Mexico-based multidisciplinary artist who uses social collaboration in response to timely and site-specific issues. He was raised on the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota and is of Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara, Lakota, and European descent. He produces multi-pronged projects that take many forms and materials that interweave performance and political action to communicate stories about 21st century indigeneity. His work provokes us to engage with Indigenous peoples and values apart from the lens of colonial social structuring and often present a call to action to protect the land from capitalist exploits. His work has been exhibited internationally in such places as the Gardner Museum, Washington Project for the Arts, Art Mirror, Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, and the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, among others. He lectures, participates in residencies and large-scale projects around the globe, and his work is in many public collections. He holds a BFA from the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe and was the 2019 Joan Mitchell Foundation recipient for painters and sculptors, as well as the recipient of the Museum of Arts and Design's 2018 inaugural Burke Prize. Thank you so much, Raven and Cannupa, for joining us tonight. I wanted to give our viewers some logistical information. This is being streamed live on Facebook and YouTube, and you can ask questions. Raven is going to be fielding some of the questions throughout the talk. So if you have something that's a burning question, feel free to ask it. And we'll also be returning to some questions at the end of the discussion. Thanks so much, Raven and Cannupa.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for having us. Oh, whoops. Maybe I should turn down my volume here so there's no echo. Well, thank you for the introduction, Polly, and thank you, Fine Arts Center, for organizing this talk and the one that's going to happen on Thursday, and also for providing some views of the opera, some download codes so that others were able to see the opera. And as I'll be explaining, the opera was a live production that we spent many years working on, and only half of the performances were able to be seen, as of course COVID shut down the entire production halfway through. But everything has moved online, and It's going to be up indefinitely as far as we know, so that we can, try to reimburse this massive project and pay all the musicians that were involved, and just let it be seen, all of the work that we ended up doing. I also, as Polly mentioned, want to give a shout out to our sister Du Yun, who was a co-composer on the project, and who was also, as Cannupa and I would go out to work on this project over the years, they'd throw Du Yun in the same Airbnb with us, and we had a lot of good times hanging out, talking, discussing what this project is, thinking very deeply about it, having dinner, having drinks, and we miss her greatly that she's not here with us on this, but she had something she had to attend to tonight. But I guess what I want to do is just start off talking about how this project started. We hope that you will also join in on Thursday when we will talk. I will also be moderating the discussion with the librettists, Aja Kushwa-Duncan and Douglas Kearney, as well as the other director and the person responsible for bringing all this together, Yuval Sharon, renowned opera director and amazing artist, and he's going to give a lot of insight even before my involvement in this, because there's still a lot I don't know how this came about. So that'll be one of my questions for him on Thursday. But I was approached by Yuval in 2000, I think it was 2017. Yuval had invited me out to LA to see his opera that he was working on, which was a version of War of the Worlds. And I hadn't heard of Yuval before that because he is known for this wild opera called Hopscotch that took place entirely in cars on the freeway of Los Angeles, on the freeways and streets of Los Angeles. And depending which vehicle you sat in, you saw a different story. So I knew he was very experimental and had a lot of just wild ideas that I definitely was interested in what he was thinking up for his next project. And so we went and we had lunch together, and he asks me, he says, well, he tells me there's been an invitation coming up for the year 2020. It is the anniversary of Plymouth Rock. I guess it's the 400-year anniversary. And there was an invitation that he had received of doing an opera about the first Thanksgiving. And he said, what do you think about that? And I said, hell no, I don't want to do that. That sounds terrible. I don't know anything about the first Thanksgiving also. And also it's even though I'm a native person, and maybe that's why you asked me, Yuval, which I appreciate. It's not my tribe. That's some other tribe that I don't know enough about. And I'm willing to do the research, but let's think about what we're getting into if we decide to do this. And he agreed with me. He thought, it could be a can of worms. It could turn. I mean, I just imagine construction paper, pilgrim hats or something, or turkey. The things you make when you're in elementary school. And we started talking, and we started thinking, well, we know there's a myth here somewhere. Both of us have been brought up in school to understand that we are being force-fed this story, and it's sugar-coated, and it's costumed up, and it's completely whitewashed. Let's make an opera about that whitewashing. And so we started developing this project. We roped in Du Yun, and Yuval had already worked with Douglas Kearney on a previous opera. So we started gathering our team with the librettists and started figuring out what this story was. And this is where I want to bring it up to where Cannupa is that as once we got this story developed, once the music was mostly done, and before we got everybody together, once we started casting people, we started thinking, well, we're going to need to start figuring out what this looks like. What is the set going to look like? What are the costumes and regalia going to look like? What should the people even look like who are portraying indigenous people or the pilgrims? And the first person I thought up was a friend of mine, good friend of mine, brilliant artist sitting here, Cannupa Hanska Luger, and knowing mostly about his sculptural work, but also Cannupa and I had spent some time. He invited me up to Standing Rock in 2016 during the DAPL occupation, and he was organizing performances there. I mean, a completely interdisciplinary artist. And so I introduced Cannupa to Yuval, and I'm going to pass it over to Cannupa to explain what happened next.
Yeah, hello everybody. So that, once again, thanks to everybody. Thank you also, Raven. That introduction to Yuval, I remember you had called me prior to and said, doing this crazy thing, you know, maybe you should, I want to drop your name on it. How do you feel about, you know, making costumes for an opera? And I didn't know anything about theater or especially like opera really. And but the first conversation that I had with Yuval after you made the connect, we started talking about some of the things that I thought would be important for what the look of the thing could be. And I was really kind of trying to encourage Yuval to get two costume designers, one to do the host community and then one to do the arrival community, and kind of separate the two so that when the costumes met on the stage, they were developed out of two completely different paradigms, two completely different ways of thinking. And I guess I thought, I was like, you know, just aesthetically, the visuals of this kind of clash of culture, I thought was important to communicate, especially if we're talking about colonialism and Western expansion and one cultural paradigm colliding into another, and how our variation, how our protocols, how the things that we have normalized within these two different cultures, how they would clash, you know. And so, as you know, once we're talking about that, I'm asking, like, what are the sets going to be made out of? I'd really like to use some of that material for the host's regalia. You know, ideas around how it's embedded. The people are an extension of the land, so whatever our set is the people should be an extension of that, and all of these different. I had a bunch of ideas anyway, coming at it from somebody who doesn't know anything about it. I was like, oh, I got a lot of ideas about this, you know. And so as I was talking with Yuval, you know, we had a really good kind of back and forth, our rapport and being able to kind of like workshop and I don't know, express ideas and kind of go back and forth, opened up, you know, the next strange leap in my relationship to Sweetland was Yuval called me like a week later or 5 days later or something and asked what I thought about co-directing the opera. He said, you know, we have two composers, we have two librettists, and he was like, after our kind of conversation, I feel like you shared a lot of really good ideas that I want to use, and I wouldn't be comfortable using them without you involved. So I wanted to ask you first, would you be interested in co-directing? And I had no idea about any of that, and I was like, let me think about it for like a day or so, just because I don't want to get you know, step out of my capacity, you know. But after talking with you know, I think I called Raven shortly after that and was asking, you know, what should I do, and then talked to Yuval and kind of got his reaffirmed aspect. He has a background in opera. He could help me facilitate all of the logistic aspects of it. But I realized what I could provide as a novice in the field is try to help provide context to the performers out of why they are thinking the way they are, why their voices are written the way they are, all of these sorts of things. So I agreed to it, and I think it was the last of the kind of creative team to come on to this project. And so a lot of it was like looking at what was already developed. I had a full libretto to read through. I had the music and like lack of knowledge on how to comprehend either one of them. Is like what I brought to the table. But I think in that limitation also, I also knew, like, had the advantage of not knowing what not to do, you know. So I could ask questions that maybe would have been bypassed if I had been a seasoned opera director. So it was really kind of amazing though to see how all of this is, and to really kind of think of opera as a almost like an installation piece that also used time, you know, as it's like a durational installation. I think we often called it that. So thinking about how you could get people to move through what the aesthetics of that blocking and kind of communication would be, and then really think about the sets as like an immersive installation experience, which I do have a bit of a background in. So I was like, well, yeah, I can do this. What does opera mean? I think that was one of my first questions. Like, I know it's Italian. What does it mean? Like, what's the translation? And Yuval had told me that it was to work. It's to work. And I was like, well, I know how to work. I can do this. So that was my introduction into engaging with all of this. And then we began to gather collectively and have conversations and really start looking at what all of the material is, how the material kind of relates to each other. And then there is like creative yet brutal exchange of like dissecting and putting together all. It's like building Frankenstein's monster. You have all of these wonderful pieces, but you got to chop them up and reassemble something else. So I was like, oh, this is crazy. I like this.
Yeah, that's interesting. You say the Frankenstein, and as Cannupa is explaining, he had no previous knowledge of opera. I have to admit, me neither. I compose a lot of works. I compose chamber works. I work with electronic music. I build instruments, but at most, I'd written songs or I'd done one operetta project. But before this project, knew nothing about opera. I still don't know if I know anything about opera, but I'm getting some invites now because of Sweetland. But we had Du Yun. Du Yun is a master at opera and a Pulitzer Prize winning composer for her operas. So we learned a lot from her. And also this thing that Cannupa is saying about treating it like an installation. That is definitely something in my background. And a lot of our discussions were about that. And also Du Yun working a lot with video and the multimedia-ness of opera. I feel like that was a common language amongst the entire creative team. Douglas and Aja as well, you know, I think very visually and time-based like that as well, even though their medium is text. So there was no real rules to how to make this thing. And for those of you who have seen the opera, as you have seen, we did whatever we wanted in some ways. I mean, there were two diverging storylines. If you bought a ticket to this opera, you saw one of the two stories, and you had to go again a second time to see the other half. And the audiences and storylines would converge and diverge and meet up in the same place by the very end. But all of this was really interesting to think about, as if it was a long duration composed installation, site-specific installation. And a lot of that for me came together, and maybe Cannupa has some thoughts on this. We have been meeting in different locations. The team met in Santa Fe. They met in Berlin, in the years before the opera was starting. We met a lot in LA, but until we were able to confirm the site of the LA State Historic Park, did a lot of this start to make sense. We started remembering or becoming aware of the history of this spot, which encompasses of course, Tongva. It was a Tongva village, and then also a site of one of the early Spanish missions. Still a very large Mexican-American community has stayed in that area. And of course, Chinatown, which is right there. So all of this was either by coincidence, or it's just what the core of this onion of myth was already covering up. The fact that we have Du Yun, who is Chinese, born and raised composer, living in the United States, it worked out so beautifully that all of these narratives came together and never felt forced. And what we were always joking about, this united colors of trauma That was the last kind of thing we wanted to make. So yeah, I just want to see what some thoughts Cannupa has on that also, and also we welcome any comments or questions, and we'll fill those as they come in. We're not really waiting till the end. If you have any questions or comments, especially if you've seen the opera, go ahead and put those in the chat.
Yeah, I think one thing that I would like to talk about that I think we, the big kind of challenge of why we were doing this was really around recognizing what we had all learned in public school, and as our history, as the history of America and the celebration of rugged individualism, like all of these kind of like stories that we've been force-fed at a young age. So it's kind of embedded in some like developmental parts of our brain. I think coming to the realization that, this is a myth, like this thing is made up. How it actually, there's no way how it actually happened is how it's been represented throughout time. And it's definitely not the way my like third or fourth grade teacher told me this went. Like there's no way, And so kind of like, accepting that reality, accepting the fact that what we know about all of this is made up, was an opportunity for us to exchange with something that was, maybe not the truth, but more honest, seeking honesty over truth in an effort to build a new myth, This isn't also how we presented it isn't exactly how it actually went, but we are allowing an opportunity to create a myth on top of that myth and have the two stand together. And really even allow what we had learned in public school and primary school, at a young age, and what we perpetuate every day by not really considering the difference, allow a space to build myth on top of that, and allow that myth that we've all been taught to contradict, and try to silence, the what was potentially the reality of that exchange. And there's power on kind of like every side of that. The idea of pilgrims, of displaced people coming to America. They always come with like the cleanest clothes and ready to disperse civilization across the nation. And the reality of that trip is grueling, they arrived sick, they arrived hungry, and I think without America recognizing what it had to struggle through, it removes any power of being able to like go, to move past that, to like learn from that, and to be, compassionate with those suffering that same experience. And as long as we don't tell that honest story, there's no space for empathy. And so that was kind of like one of the fun exchanges of allowing the story to displace the audience, split the audience, and move them away from their comfort and run them through two different tracks of a narrative. They were going simultaneously, but they didn't experience the same thing. And then to converge and have a moment to communicate it, and then be tore apart again, and then have to finish this exchange. I thought, there were things that I think only the landscape that we got to perform this work on, all of that information, all of that movement and displacement, loss and, glory, the horror and the glory of it all combined, there was something even in the experience of the audience traveling that path that I thought was important. And once again, to look at the land that we got to perform this work on, it has that history embedded in it, the landscape, the dirt, the layers of construction, train routes, watering holes, farmland. This little patch of land that we worked on, which is now a park, a state historical park, layers beneath it is that history and that narrative that we were, had the opportunity to open up. And really, I think the landscape helped inform and influence the way that we kind of brought all of these pieces together.
Yeah, it was that was very much a character in the opera, was the land itself, the park, if you will, and recognizing that it was no longer a park when you were sitting inside of Sweetland, inside of the opera. The park disappeared, which is of big credit to the set designers and the team. You know, there was at least 100 people working on this opera, besides Cannupa and the librettists and Yuval, and we always want to give them a shout out for the incredible work that they did. There's a question coming in. Maybe I'll answer that. I'll say that one in a second. But one thing I wanted to talk about before getting to this question was this, that Cannupa and I can both talk about, is this hybridization that happened in the opera. And that happened because, well, there's always this dilemma, right, of contemporary Native artists. A pitfall can be that you start making work that's pan-Indian, or there's an expectation that you have to speak for all of the tribes in the United States. And so at the same time, we are speaking about all the tribes in the United States. We're talking about people coming, these arrivals, as we've named them in the opera, starting in the East Coast and coming all the way until they make it to the West Coast. A lot of different arrivals. Then, meanwhile, there were arrivals coming from the South, the Spanish up into the Southwest, which is the history that my people have encountered. But how do we talk about all of this and squeeze it into the hour or the double hour of, that this opera is? And so there was, sonically, I can speak about some of those tactics, and it was never to replicate the music of the Wampanoag or any tribe. We were never trying to quote actual tribal music. We were never going to borrow. That's something that I don't do in my other work, so there was no reason to start doing it in this work, even if this work is semi-historical or alternate universe historical. So Duyen and I thought of a lot of different tactics of how to do this. We might start with tribal music. We might find similarities in tribal music. She has some knowledge of Mongolian music, which we thought was close enough to some American Indian music. We started hybridizing all of this. We started putting it together. We started making melodies go backwards so that it kind of seemed like a native melody. We would, of course, juxtapose this or collage it against a harpsichord or a Baroque chord progression, Renaissance era kind of thing. And some of these would be linked to characters, but they were also tactics to avoid this quoting that I'm talking about. So my question for Cannupa is also some of these tactics of the costume design, how those were thought up. And I know, a lot of, again, one of the reasons I thought of Cannupa was this, his work he's doing in imagining a future, imagining these alternate universes and what that looks like. So let us tell us more about that, Cannups.
I guess as we were engaging with this, with that same idea, I'm sure a lot of the native listeners to this thing have experienced when you get an opportunity to speak in front of space, you're like speaking under the umbrella of indigenous voice and checking the box of whoever provided that space for you. And yet we can't represent everybody, I can barely represent my own tribe. I'm weird enough to be like on the periphery. I thought one of the tactics that I've utilized to kind of like bypass any of that commodification of culture and co-opting of lateral cultures and the violence that's inherent in that, I decided to work in a realm of kind of like in my studio practice. I do a lot of indigenous futurist projects right now, and that's really looking at kind of ideas of technology, indigenous cosmology and thought process, things to how to survive on the landscape as a technology, and not get hung up on the idea of the 21st century. All of our concepts of technology is actually just mechanisms to that we consider this technology. This is what tech is. This is actually just an interface for a really old technology, which is communicate. It's the same thing that our throat developed for. So this isn't the technology, this is a mechanism. And so I think about indigenous knowledge in the realms of technological advances, like sustainable practices, all of these sorts of things. And in my studio practice, I try to imagine a future that is like a post-colonial future, a post-dominant culture future, where we are an extension of the land, rather, we belong to it rather than it belongs to us. And so the development of the regalia and the bodies that I was kind of working with, I know in that future space that I create regalia, it's all about repurposing existing materials. So it's looking at what our 21st century has produced, and how we could reclaim that material rather than producing new material for our goods. How could we reuse things that are already existing to help disintegrate them, to help make them disappear from our planet, because we have excess at this point. And so the core material that I used for the regalia of the host population was repurposed. It was actually all remnant industrial felt. So felt used in industrial application. I have access to a space in Albuquerque. I live in Glorieta, New Mexico, so I'm not far from Albuquerque and Santa Fe. But in Albuquerque, I found a space that has a lot of wool, industrial felt wool byproduct, and I can get this stuff for free. So I have bags and bags of it, and that's what I use as a material, because it's all wool, so it has this kind of like historical relationship to civilization and the idea of like domestication of animals, the weaving. This is like the industrial version of weaving. I know felting is a very old practice, but as it's been applied to these materials, this is an industrialized process. And I thought it would be really interesting to actually build this regalia outside of any of the forms that we consider presently like normal clothes, and look at some of the customary designs that I've seen in the past, and then kind of exhaust that by adapting it to this new industrial material. So the host that I kind of developed in my mind as far as regalia isn't set in the timeline that we've experienced. It exists maybe in an alternate universe, maybe in a future experience where it's like a post-colonial experience, and perhaps this host community is the same as the one that I'm kind of playing around with in my future ancestral technology projects at home. So that allowed time to really recognize that culture isn't something that's preserved, it's something that's maintained. It's not the preservation of culture as we understand it through going to the museum, but what culture looks like when you're on the res or in your home with your family. Like, you adapt to the materials you have access to and you move that through. This is a process of maintenance versus preservation. And I thought of this culture, we found it somewhere along the lines of that maintenance of culture. We don't know their name, we don't know their history, their relationship, cosmology to the land, but we got to see them for 2 brief moments. That's kind of the background of the regalia that I built for that.
Mm-hmm. We have 2 questions that have come in so far. I'll answer Rachel's first, and then I'll go to Dory's. Rachel asks, and I'm going to have Cannupa answer this one before I do. Rachel asks, echoes and expulsions, which is the finale of the opera that everybody, both sides of the opera end in the same spot. And that is this finale epilogue called Echoes and Expulsions. Was exquisite and seemed to be stylistically a departure from the earlier part of the opera. Can you describe major decisions made to make it so different, especially having singers off stage? So, maybe Cannupa can describe the way that scene is much different than the rest of the opera, and also the way that people were positioned, singers, actors, and also the audience.
Yeah, I think so. I don't think this. I know because we talked about it at great extent. there were conscious decisions to make that thing change as the audience moved through these two kind of narratives where one contradicts the other. We always talked about it as like a redaction of the actual story rather than erasure. You could see the dark marks of what was omitted from the narrative, rather than them just not being there. We thought about that as the audience moved through these spaces. So when they enter in, you see there's a timeline that we were kind of playing around with. That first contact is introduced when the whole audience is together. And from that moment on, the audience is split and broke apart and goes down different paths. And so what we thought with Echoes and Expulsions, the last part of the opera, is to look at what happens. This is like the ghost of Christmas future, worst case, the most plainest way that I could tell you this whole thing. That space is the ghost of Christmas future. That space is the space that kind of like tells you what those potential futures could look like without any sort of acknowledgement or understanding of it. So there is, we highlight the land on the last part where we covered it at the opening in the beginning with the screen and kind of projected onto that all of these ideas of relating to our past. When we brought the audience all back together, we removed the thin veil of that screen and allowed the landscape that we were physically on. This is a park, and just beyond the chain-linked fence was a staging area to like get that park developed, and it was the closest to like a post-apocalyptic experience, embedded in that park. And we were like, it would be unwise not to utilize the amount of time and money that it took to make this post-apocalyptic landscape. Like, it's free, it's right there. We need to put, make that the centerpiece of the experience. So excuse me, removing all of the singers, allows their sonic experience to still bleed in, to still let you know that you're a part of an opera, that there are people singing literally right under your feet, that you're standing on the shoulders of that history. You're standing above those narratives, and to allow those arias to talk about the history of this landscape, and project the landscape as it is presently, make that focal, and let you look at, with all of the harsh and true realities of the colonial experience. Look at what we got, look at all of that effort, all of that sacrifice, and we lay before you the landscape like tore apart, laden with debris of our attempt to build civilization, and place a single child out there, singing in this debris, singing to you, singing to the audience, singing to his ancestors, perhaps singing to ghosts of that exist in that landscape, to really look at. To allow people to consider, like, when the show is over, the opera goes on. Your trip home is a part of the opera. That the long, sit in traffic, that last turn, that desire to go get a taco at the taco shop because you got hungry all of a sudden. All of that is a part of the opera suddenly by making the landscape of Los Angeles. It was a way to really embed that place, that narrative, into the opera as we're bringing people to present and kind of projecting their ideas into the future.
Yeah. It happened so beautifully that worked out like that. It's and that's a great analogy. The Ghost of Christmas Future for me was kind of like a Philip K. Dick kind of thing, where you're in the opera and you're confined to one of the two stages where the scenes take place. And you might hear, a ambulance or police car on the streets of LA while you're in there listening to the opera, or you see a police helicopter flying above you, and you remember you're in downtown LA. Yet you're still stuck in this myth telling about the past, I guess, or this alternate universe past. And at the very end, that's when this, if we call it this onion, that last layer is finally exposed, and you're back in the present, talking about very contemporary issues and problems, and all of this all of these topics we've been speaking about, forced migration, human trafficking, all of this ongoing genocide is now brought into the present and has expanded onto the streets of Los Angeles, has expanded into the hills of Echo Park, has expanded into East LA. And you can see 360 around you, downtown LA, Chinatown, which has already been referenced in the previous scene. And yet you don't see any singers anymore either, there, as Cannupa pointed out. And one thing that you don't get the sense of from the video is that these voices were coming from underneath the seats. You were surrounded by singers. There was a tuba in the distance, a tuba player playing his part in the distance. So a lot of this also folded in. It became very acoustic. It became very spatialized, and so it becomes quite a shift in experience as you're watching that. And I'm going to answer the next question here in a little bit. Is I feel like that did translate fairly successful on the video. I was pleased with how that came across. And what you see in this final scene is these 3 and 4 20th century micro narratives of factual events. The Chinatown massacre. We're talking about sterilization of Native and Mexican women in California. And so all of this becomes much more real. If we were hinting at myth before, we're definitely talking about things that have happened by the end. Dory asks a question. Recognizing this was created to be a site-specific, in-person experience, how hard was it to transition to make a recorded performance? Are there elements that became easier, harder? I very much appreciated the transcription, the direction of the video production, and wonder how different the experience would have been without that. I'll just say briefly before Cannupa answers this that, of course, we didn't plan for this to be a video. We were already documenting for KCET television, was making a documentary about Sweetland, and had been following us around during the making of the opera, and was already starting to document some of the performances. It came down to a matter of days. I wasn't there. Cannupa was there in those final days of performance as he flew back to make this video happen and to help with that. But that was not planned to do that. I give huge credit to the team and the videographers and KCET filmmakers who pulled that together. But there were some things that translated that I was happy with. There were also some things that you would never be able to experience in the same way as being there live. You have any thoughts on that, Cannups?
No, I think, I preferred the physical experience. It was totally built for like that space, I think they did a really great job with the video. We hustled hard to make that happen. Like it was, considering the pressure, that we were kind of up against to produce that piece, I'm thoroughly impressed with how it came out and what did translate. If there was anything that's absent in that, is really your being on the land. There were, as it exists as a filmed video, you only get that one night to experience it. But because we were there for several nights during the opening weekend, and all the rehearsals up until the opening, there were variables that would change every single night. So there was something really powerful about performing this work on the land. Raven had mentioned the helicopters. We were like maybe 5 blocks away from LAPD helicopter pad. And so every night you'd get them flying over at different points, and it somehow always was like poignant somehow. Like it would happen right when there was like a moment where like a helicopter should fly over the top. We were right next to one of the transit lines, and it would come every 10 minutes, and you would hear this train line shacklacking, as it moved through. The lights from it. Geese and other like waterfowl that somehow made a go at it in this park. you would hear them and see them fly over. There was something about it being, you know, that I think the video lacks is your physicality of there, a slight drizzle, you know, the cold air, the moving with bodies next to you, and the sensation of being displaced from your peers as the audience. You know, those were all things that we kind of went to like great labor to present that, you know, unfortunately the video can't really create. But you know, all of that being said, in consideration of what we were able to accomplish with those cinematographers that there at the time, like it was a crazy night to do it like that. And there were certain freedoms as far as performance and performers using just a few audience members where people can set an eye and focus a point that, you know, from an acting standpoint. If you know your audience is like a person, you know, a camera lens, and that's going to be projected out, there are certain ways to like really hit and cheat some of the storytelling with that. So that's kind of an advantage, you know, as an audience member, you might be in the right seat, or you might be like right underneath the person. You don't get a good look of them. You're like looking up the preacher's nose the entire time that they're banging out some really amazing stuff. So that was kind of one of the advantages of using a camera and filming the work, is that we could place ourselves, you know, where the optimal position to experience the opera is. And I think that's how it became successful.
Yeah, that brings up a good point. There were no bad seats when you bought a ticket to this opera. You could sit anywhere you wanted. You had that freedom, that agency to sit as close to the performers as you wanted. I mean, the performers were also moving, so if you sat in the back, you might actually end up being very close to some of the action. One of the coyotes running up on you or something. And so, and yeah, this train, it kind of leads to the next question. Polly asks a question. Raven, you talked about the final scene. It reminded me of the drumming project that I did up at Colorado Springs, a piece called Drum Grid, where drummers are located on the streets around Colorado College. And also the Documenta project, the post-commodity project that I did years ago, where we use sound and space. Can I talk about this? Yes, and Cannupa answered a lot of it. I think, of course, we wrote music to go along with this, and we had the logistical problem, but also maybe this kind of fun or unique idea that because we had the audience moving around, we couldn't also have the orchestra move to different sites either. That would have been a logistical nightmare. So there was a lot of pumping of music between stages, having the orchestra be stationary, but also blending their signals to be fed into, let's say, the first scene and the last scene, but also more of the site-specific sounds. As Cannupa mentioned, the geese, you might hear the geese or birds or see a bird flying above you, and then it gets interrupted by the Gold Line Metro train car whizzing by every 15 minutes. And while it's not something I put in the score that the train was going to be going by at that exact time, you had this sense of encroachment. You heard a bird then be interrupted by the train, or maybe even you couldn't even hear the singer because the train was much louder than the words they were trying to say. And that's what the opera is about anyway. The opera is about manifest destiny, about the train, the railroad cutting across the country, about the Chinese labor put into that, making that happen. And all of it just collapsed in on itself for the sake of sound. I'm happy when that happens. That is not planned, but that's what the composition should do. We got a 10-minute warning that we're on our last 10 minutes. We welcome any other questions that come. We also, I want to ask Cannupa quickly about his settlement project, which is the next big project that he was doing after Sweetland and concurrently with Sweetland, but also got interrupted also by COVID, and also is relevant to the 400-year anniversary of Plymouth. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, settlement was originally, it was kind of like supported by this group, this gathering of like 4 nations: the Wampanoag, the what is it? The Netherlands, the UK, and the United States. I've been working for the past apparently like 10 years, kind of off and on, to create some sort of 400th anniversary commemoration of the Mayflower. And a couple of years ago, I was asked to participate in this, and almost identical to Raven's story. I was like, no, no, I don't know nothing about that. Like, I was like, we ain't never had no pilgrims come around where I'm from. I'm like, from the Midwest. We were like, you know, one of the last spaces for Western expansion. They kind of like try to slide past us, and then started a war, you know. So I was like, I don't think that's, you know, there wasn't a Mayflower kind of story for me. There was no pilgrims. It was military, you know. And but you know, as I started thinking about it more, knowing that the Wampanoag were one of the 4 nations kind of involved in this, you know, I thought, well, they have good representation at least within this, so that's something, you know. They had an advisory board for cultural sensitivity around kind of what these commemorations would be. And really, I started to think, like, you know, what would be really great is if we're commemorating these 400 years, let's talk about how those 400 years of colonization have affected people, kind of indigenous populations across the Americas and beyond. And so I started a project to build a settlement in the center of Plymouth, UK, in their Central Park. I was like, let's build a settlement here, you know, and I'm going to invite all my friends, you know. So I put out a big call to, like, you know, 60 artists who I knew, who I was comfortable with. Raven is a member of this cohort. Really, I was, you know, when it first started, it was 8, and then it ended up, I was able to kind of like leverage and push for, there's like 30 artists that are involved in this thing. So we got some of the King's money, and I was able to spread it back to the Americas, where it was stolen from, and give it out a little bit at a time to each of these artists to do these projects that COVID interrupted, and we had to transform into a digital occupation. So once again, I mean, I think these are the strengths that artists have that maybe institutions don't, is that we are we're adaptable, man. We have, our knees are always bent, as I say. Like, we have to be able to, like, wait for the ground to fall out from underneath us on any given day. And so we're nimble, you know. And I think that nimbleness allowed us to kind of move this project into a digital realm, which I thought, you know, honestly, thinking about it, like, you know, we were always wanting to high road the colonial powers that be, you know, with this settlement project. We didn't want to do a lot of tongue-in-cheek work and go around the UK planting flags and claiming places and stuff like that. We wanted to really talk about what it means to be Indigenous in the 21st century. And the artists who were gathered for this thing are serious, and they're doing work that is profound and generous, like so generous. And I think that's something within Indigenous communities, as far as underneath that umbrella, you know, that is pretty familiar, is there's an importance of hospitality in our cultures. And I think that hospitality is probably what was perverted and taken advantage of to kind of get us into the position that we are presently. And so I wanted to figure out a way that we could bring kind of all of these artists to share their work, their experience, and they're from many different tribes. You know, if I had my way totally, I would have brought 570 of them, one from every nation. But as it was, I could only bring 30, and I was really kind of looking at pockets and people who I knew, because we were going to be all camping together. I was like, I need to be with people who I know aren't going to like freak out. Like, I got friends who I'm just like, I don't know if we could all be in the same place at the same time, you know? And so it was really kind of, you know, when we came up with our 30, it was really looking at how these little sections would be able to complement one another, live together in a kind of a confined space, and protect one another, create a sense of safety and security within those ideas. So as it transformed into a digital occupation, it really kind of alleviated any of those tensions, and kind of opened up the opportunity to create a settlement in a landscape that doesn't have borders, you know, that's not necessarily claimed in the way that we've experienced the physical landscape. And I was like, you know, there's an important lesson in that, so let's lean into it. And I think that's something that, even, you know, going back to Sweetland, you know, a lot of those complications, a lot of those difficulties, a lot of the logistics of presenting something like this I think we all had, many conversations around, do we try to hide it? Do we try to mask it? Or do we recognize what it is and just lean into that, lean into the fact that there's no way we're going to stop the gold line. You know what I'm saying? Like the gold line's been running this whole time, and so how do we like lean into the fact that it is there, and rather than suspend disbelief, kind of like open up that space. And once again, I think that goes to, something to be said about creativity, artists working on projects, trying to problem solve in ways that like, maybe an engineer might miss, or also just like collectively thinking about things. We could have I might have a very good idea, but it's just impossible. But when you run that through like 5 other people, 6 other people, you actually develop a consensus kind of route that everybody's kind of backing and supporting. And more often than not, it was like, well, the land is also one of these contributors. So what our environment is, we we can't ask them to stop. Geese are going to fly. So
there's a quick question. I want Cannupa to answer it in like 30 seconds. Blair asked about the captain's letterman jacket or Jimmy Jin's bolo tie. If you could quickly explain that, because those are important.
Yeah, captain is a football captain, like no question. Captain, that's straight up right there. Like I had my best days in high school, and now this is, all I have to remember. So that's captain. Jimmy Jin's bolo tie is a straight turquoise penis, like no question. Tip pointing up, the whole time. He was kind of like a hypersexualized romantic idea of that, like that Hollywood cowboy, which is also just like such a major myth. So we're like, let's lean into it. Let's almost make it homoerotic in its masculinity, and so we kind of like bumped up a few things in that.
Great. Just real quick, Cannupa's project is settlement.org. Is that?
Yeah.
And then sweetlandopera.com is still up, and that's where you can see the opera.
And we also have some we call them tickets, even though it's like you register for an event at the Colorado Springs Fine Arts Center. There's still some left to be used by viewers. So anyone who hasn't seen it can get one of these complimentary until they run out. That's how we're doing it. It was funded. I want to also give thanks to the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation grant for Southwest Arts and Culture. We think broadly in terms of the concept of Southwest, but having 2 local, Southwest artists here tonight has been fantastic. And you've just brought so much light to seeing the opera. And I hope anyone who has seen it, has a chance to go back and rewatch it to, sort of see these new insights that have been brought to us tonight. Thank you so much for coming and spending your time with us. And for anyone who's here, we just want to remind everyone there's a part 2, and that will be Thursday night. We're live now, but both will be up online eventually. And we have the librettist talking about the story and director. So that should be really enlightening as well. Another sort of insight into how the story evolves. And Raven will be moderating for us again on that night. So we really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Cannupa, for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thank you. It's been wonderful. It's nice to see you all.
Yeah, good. We hope that we'll be able to have you both up in Colorado Springs sometime in the very near future and, sharing more of your work.
Oh, let me state also before we go, I do have an exhibition at the Denver Art Museum coming up this year. And right. It's all about collaboration. So all of the works in there, it's with another artist named Marie Watt. And some of the regalia from the opera will be set there. And I think it will also be another opportunity to see the opera. They want to kind of like show it if COVID allows, but there's an opportunity to see the pieces up close and personal, a few of them. So
yeah, that'd be cool.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much again. Thanks everyone who came tonight, and we'll see you again soon.
Okay, thank you.